In the depths of winter, when the Dakota wilderness becomes a frozen graveyard where hope goes to die, something extraordinary happened that would challenge everything we think we know about survival, human cruelty, and the unexpected angels that walk among us. This is not just another survival story. This is the account of how one man's darkest hour became another's defining moment of heroism. Picture this: the sound of chains scraping against frozen earth, metal grinding against stone, echoing through a forest so quiet that even the wind seems afraid to speak. Somewhere in those woods, a human being is being dragged like cargo, mile after brutal mile, leaving a trail that tells a story no one should ever have to live. But this story doesn't end where you think it will. What you're about to read happened in the remote wilderness of North Dakota, where civilization feels like a distant memory and help seems impossible. It's a story that law enforcement still talks about in hushed tones, that changed the life of everyone it touched, and that proves sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most unexpected places. This is the true account of Marcus Chen, a software engineer from Minneapolis whose weekend hiking trip became a nightmare beyond imagination. It's the story of Dale Whitehorse, a Dakota hunter whose morning routine turned him into an accidental savior. And it's the story of how human evil and human goodness collided in the middle of nowhere, creating a moment that neither man would ever forget. You think you know how survival stories go. You think you can predict who lives and who dies, who helps and who hurts. This story will prove you wrong. Because sometimes, when all hope is lost and death seems certain, the forest itself sends help in the form of someone who refuses to look the other way. Get ready to experience a story that will make you question everything you think you know about the kindness of strangers and the strength of the human spirit. Marcus Chen had always believed that technology could solve any problem. As a senior software engineer for a major tech company in Minneapolis, he spent his days creating algorithms that could predict human behavior, analyze massive datasets, and automate complex processes. But no amount of coding had prepared him for the brutal reality he was about to face in the remote wilderness of North Dakota. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Marcus had been working 18-hour days for months, debugging a critical system that handled millions of transactions daily. His girlfriend Sarah had been after him for weeks to take a break, to disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with nature. She had even researched the perfect spot for him: Turtle Mountain State Forest in North Dakota, a place so remote that cell phone towers were just a distant dream. "You need this, Marcus," Sarah had said, packing his hiking gear with the same precision she applied to everything in her life as a nurse. 2 days. No laptops, no phones, no screens. Just you, the wilderness, and some much-needed perspective. Marcus had reluctantly agreed, though part of him couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily disconnect from the world. He drove his silver Honda Civic the 4 hours from Minneapolis to the forest entrance, grumbling about the time he could be spending fixing code instead of wandering around trees. But as he pulled into the small parking area at the trailhead, something about the absolute silence made him pause. The forest was beautiful in a way that no computer screen could replicate. Ancient oak and maple trees stretched toward a grey October sky, their leaves painted in shades of red and gold that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. The air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of earth and decomposing leaves that reminded Marcus of childhood camping trips with his father. He shouldered his lightweight backpack, checked his compass one final time, and started down the main trail. The plan was simple: hike 5 miles to a small lake, set up camp, and spend the night under the stars. Sarah had packed enough food for 3 days, though Marcus planned to be back in Minneapolis by Sunday evening. For the first hour, the hike was everything Sarah had promised it would be. The physical exertion felt good after months of sitting in front of computers. His mind began to quiet as the rhythmic sound of his boots on the trail replaced the constant noise of notifications and deadlines. He started to understand why people did this sort of thing. The trail was well marked and easy to follow, winding through dense forest that seemed untouched by human presence. Marcus encountered no other hikers, which surprised him until he remembered that it was mid-October on a Friday afternoon. Most people were at work, trapped in offices like he usually was, staring at screens instead of experiencing the real world. By late afternoon, Marcus reached the small lake Sarah had marked on his map. It was perfect, a mirror-smooth body of water surrounded by trees that reflected like a painting on its surface. He found a clearing about 50 yards from the water's edge and began setting up his tent, proud that he remembered the lessons his father had taught him 20 years earlier. As darkness fell, Marcus built a small campfire and heated up one of the dehydrated meals Sarah had packed. The food tasted better than it had any right to, and the silence of the forest began to feel peaceful rather than unsettling. For the first time in months, Marcus felt his shoulders relax. Maybe Sarah had been right. Maybe he did need this. He spent the evening reading a paperback book by firelight, something he hadn't done since college. The story was a thriller about a detective tracking a serial killer. But sitting alone in the wilderness made even fiction feel too intense. Marcus put the book away and simply stared into the fire, letting his mind wander in ways it never could during his usual routine. That night, he slept better than he had in months. The complete absence of city noise, the fresh air, and the physical exhaustion from hiking combined to give him the deepest rest he'd experienced in years. He woke naturally as dawn began to filter through the trees, feeling more refreshed than any amount of coffee had ever made him feel. Saturday morning was beautiful. Marcus made instant coffee over his camp stove and ate breakfast while watching mist rise from the lake's surface. He had planned to hike back that day, but the peace of the place made him reconsider. He had enough food for another night, and Sarah wouldn't expect him until Sunday evening anyway. Marcus decided to spend the day exploring some of the smaller trails that branched off from the main path. He left most of his gear at the campsite, taking only water, snacks, and his map. The day was warm for October, and he felt confident about finding his way back before dark. That confidence would prove to be a fatal mistake. The side trail Marcus chose looked well maintained on the map, but the reality was different. What had appeared to be a clear path quickly became overgrown and difficult to follow. Fallen logs blocked the way, and in several places the trail simply disappeared into thick underbrush. Marcus should have turned back. Every instinct told him to return to the main trail, but his engineer's mind saw the navigation challenge as a problem to solve. He had a map and a compass. How hard could it be to find his way through a few miles of forest? By mid-afternoon, Marcus realized he was lost. The trail he'd been following had vanished completely, and nothing around him matched what he saw on his map. The trees all looked the same, and the overcast sky made it impossible to judge direction by the sun. He tried to retrace his steps, but found that everything looked different when approached from the opposite direction. As evening approached, Marcus began to feel the first real stirrings of fear. The temperature was dropping, and he was miles from his campsite, with no way to build a fire or stay warm. He had water and snacks, but no real food. No sleeping bag, no survival gear beyond what fit in his day pack. He pressed on as darkness fell, hoping to find the main trail, or at least some landmark he could identify. The forest became a maze of shadows and obstacles. Every tree looked threatening. Every sound made his heart race. This wasn't the peaceful wilderness experience Sarah had envisioned for him. Around 10 o'clock, exhausted and increasingly desperate, Marcus saw a light through the trees. Relief flooded through him as he pushed through a thicket toward what he assumed was another camper or maybe a ranger station. Help was just ahead. His nightmare was almost over. But as Marcus emerged into a small clearing, he realized his nightmare was just beginning. The light came from a battery-powered lantern sitting on a makeshift table. 3 men in hunting camouflage were seated around the table, playing cards and drinking beer. A large pickup truck was parked at the edge of the clearing, and Marcus could see camping gear scattered around a fire that had been allowed to burn down to coals. "Help!" Marcus called out, stumbling into the circle of light. "I'm lost." "I've been walking for hours." The 3 men looked up from their cards. The largest of them, a bearded man with cold eyes and arms covered in tattoos, smiled in a way that made Marcus's stomach clench. "Well, well," the big man said, standing slowly. "Look what wandered into our camp. Boys, I think our evening just got a lot more interesting." The other 2 men laughed, and Marcus noticed they were all wearing hunting knives on their belts. Something was very wrong here, but he was too tired and disoriented to process what he was seeing. "I just need directions back to the main trail," Marcus said, backing toward the tree line. "I can pay you for your trouble." "Oh, you're going to pay us," the bearded man said, taking a step forward. "But not with money." That's when Marcus saw the chains. Heavy logging chains were coiled next to the truck, along with padlocks and what looked like restraints. This wasn't a hunting camp. This was something else entirely, something that made every survival instinct Marcus possessed scream at him to run. He turned and sprinted toward the trees, but he was exhausted from a day of hiking, and the men were fresh. They caught him before he'd gone 20 yards, tackling him to the ground with professional efficiency. As they dragged him back toward the truck, Marcus understood that his peaceful weekend in nature had become something much darker. The last thing he remembered clearly was the cold touch of metal as they locked the chains around his ankles, and the bearded man's voice explaining exactly what they had planned for him. The bearded man's name was Tommy Kruger, and Marcus would learn to fear that name more than death itself over the next 18 hours. Tommy wasn't hunting deer in the North Dakota wilderness. He was hunting something far more dangerous and infinitely more valuable on the black market: human beings. Marcus regained consciousness as cold water hit his face like a slap. He was lying on the ground next to the pickup truck, heavy chains wrapped around his ankles and locked with industrial-grade padlocks. His wrists were bound with zip ties that cut into his skin every time he moved. The three men stood over him, studying him like he was merchandise rather than a human being. "Good, you're awake," Tommy said, crouching down so his face was level with Marcus's. "Time for you to understand your new situation, college boy." Marcus tried to speak, but his mouth was too dry to form words. One of the other men, a thin guy with nervous eyes and shaking hands, kicked Marcus in the ribs hard enough to double him over. "Pay attention when Tommy's talking to you," the thin man said. Marcus would later learn this was Danny, Tommy's younger brother, and a meth addict who would do anything his older brother commanded. The third man never spoke during the entire ordeal. He was older than the other two, with grey hair and dead eyes that suggested he'd done this sort of thing many times before. Tommy called him Ray, and Ray seemed to be in charge of the practical aspects of their operation. "Here's how this works," Tommy continued, his voice calm and conversational, as if he were explaining a business transaction. "You're going to be moved to a location where some very wealthy people are waiting to meet you. They've paid a lot of money for the privilege, and they have some very specific requests about how they want their time with you to go." The implications of Tommy's words hit Marcus like physical blows. He'd read about human trafficking in the news, seen documentaries about people who disappeared into networks of criminals who treated human beings like commodities, but he'd never imagined it could happen to him, a middle-class software engineer, on a simple camping trip. "You're insane," Marcus managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "People know where I am. They'll come looking for me." Tommy laughed, a sound that contained no warmth or humanity. "No, they don't. You told your girlfriend you were going hiking somewhere in North Dakota. That's a pretty big search area, college boy. And by the time anyone realizes you're missing, you'll be long gone." Ray produced a smartphone and showed Marcus a series of photographs. They were surveillance photos of Marcus taken at various points during his drive from Minneapolis, at gas stations, rest stops, and the forest entrance. These men hadn't stumbled upon him by accident. They'd been tracking him since he left the city. "We've been watching you for 3 days, Tommy explained. "Your girlfriend posts a lot of pictures on social media. Very helpful information about your hiking plans, your schedule, even what kind of car you drive. She's actually quite pretty. Maybe we'll pay her a visit after we're done with you." The threat against Sarah ignited something primal in Marcus. He lunged at Tommy despite the chains around his ankles, managing to land one solid punch before Danny and Ray dragged him back. Tommy wiped blood from his split lip and smiled again. But this time the smile was different. "Hungrier?" "I was going to make this easy for you," Tommy said, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. "But I think you need to understand exactly how powerless you are right now." What happened next would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. The knife wasn't meant to kill him. That would reduce his value to their buyers. Instead, Tommy used it to demonstrate just how completely they controlled every aspect of Marcus's existence. The pain was excruciating, but it was the helplessness that nearly broke his mind. By the time Tommy was finished with his demonstration, Marcus understood that fighting would only make things worse. His survival depended on compliance, at least until he could find an opportunity to escape. "Much better," Tommy said, cleaning his knife on Marcus's shirt. "Now you understand the rules. You do exactly what we tell you to do, when we tell you to do it, and maybe you'll live through this. You give us any more trouble, and I'll let Danny have some fun with you." Danny gets creative when he's high. They loaded Marcus into the back of the pickup truck like cargo, chaining him to anchor points in the truck bed and covering him with a tarp. The chains were long enough to allow him some movement, but short enough to prevent any chance of escape. Ray had clearly done this before. The truck was equipped with everything needed to transport human cargo. As they drove deeper into the wilderness, Marcus tried to keep track of their direction and the time, hoping to maintain some sense of where they were taking him. But the combination of pain, shock, and the disorienting effect of being hidden under a tarp made it impossible to focus. The truck stopped several times during the night, and Marcus could hear the men talking quietly among themselves. He caught fragments of conversation about schedules, delivery times, and payments. They spoke about him the way warehouse workers might discuss a shipment of electronics, with complete detachment from the human reality of what they were doing. Around what Marcus guessed was 3 in the morning, The truck stopped for longer than usual. He heard Tommy and Ray having an argument about something, their voices growing heated. Danny seemed to be trying to mediate, but his drug-addled state made him more of a problem than a solution. The client specifically requested undamaged merchandise, Ray was saying. What you did back there reduced the value. He needed to understand his situation, Tommy replied. A little damage shows we're serious. A little damage costs us money. These people pay premium prices for premium products. Marcus realized they were arguing about him like he was a used car with cosmetic problems. The complete dehumanization was almost worse than the physical pain. These men saw him as nothing more than a source of income. The argument ended when Danny, clearly desperate for another hit of whatever drug was driving his behavior, offered to take a smaller cut of the money if they could just get moving. Money was the only thing that mattered to any of them. As the truck started moving again, Marcus began to formulate a plan. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all he had. The chains around his ankles were heavy but not impossible to manage if he could get enough leverage. The zip ties on his wrists were a bigger problem, but plastic could be broken if he could find something sharp enough to cut against. The truck bed contained various tools and equipment. Marcus couldn't see them clearly in the darkness under the tarp, but he could feel metal objects within reach of his bound hands. If he could work one of his hands free, he might be able to access something useful. The process was agonizingly slow. Every bump in the road sent shockwaves of pain through his injured body, and he had to be careful not to make any noise that would alert his captors to what he was attempting. But desperation gave him focus, and Marcus began the painstaking process of trying to free himself. It took nearly 2 hours of careful work, but Marcus finally managed to cut through one of the zip ties using a sharp edge on a piece of equipment he couldn't identify in the darkness. His left hand was free, though his right remained bound. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As dawn began to break, the truck turned onto what felt like a rougher road. Marcus could hear gravel crunching under the tires and feel the vehicle bouncing over deeper ruts. They were getting close to wherever they were taking him, and once they reached that destination, his chances of escape would become even more remote. Through a gap in the tarp, Marcus caught glimpses of dense forest on both sides of the road. They were deep in the wilderness now, far from any help. Even if he managed to escape, he would still be lost in hundreds of square miles of forest, with no food, no water, and no way to contact the outside world. But being lost in the wilderness was infinitely preferable to whatever these men had planned for him. Marcus continued working on his restraints, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether he lived or died. The truck slowed and made several turns onto progressively smaller roads. Marcus could hear Tommy giving directions to Ray, mentioning landmarks and distances that suggested they knew this area well. This wasn't their first time making this trip. Finally, the truck stopped. Marcus heard car doors slamming and footsteps approaching the tailgate. This was it. His last chance to do something before they moved him to wherever they were keeping their victims. End of the line, college boy, Tommy said as he pulled back the tarp. Time to meet your new friends. But Marcus was no longer the helpless victim they'd captured the night before. His partially freed hands and the tools he'd discovered in the truck bed had given him options. As Tommy reached down to unlock the chains, Marcus was ready to fight for his life. Marcus had found a wrench in the truck bed during his hours of captivity, and he gripped it with his freed left hand as Tommy reached for the chains around his ankles. The moment Tommy's attention focused on the padlock, Marcus swung the wrench with every ounce of strength and desperation he possessed. The metal tool caught Tommy in the temple with a sickening crack that echoed through the forest silence. The big man dropped like a stone, blood immediately beginning to pool beneath his head. Marcus didn't wait to see if Tommy was dead or unconscious. He rolled out of the truck bed and hit the ground running, despite the heavy chains still locked around his ankles. "Holy shit!" Danny screamed, fumbling for the gun tucked into his waistband. But drugs and shock made him clumsy, and the weapon slipped from his shaking hands before he could fire. Ray was faster and more experienced. He had his pistol drawn and aimed before Marcus had taken 3 steps, but the chains around Marcus's ankles caused him to stumble and fall just as Ray pulled the trigger. The bullet whistled over Marcus's head and splintered bark from a pine tree. Marcus rolled behind the truck as Ray fired again, the second shot sparking off metal. He could hear Danny sobbing and screaming about how they were all going to prison now, how his brother was dead, how everything was ruined. The meth addict was having a complete breakdown. "Shut up and help me find him," Ray shouted, but Danny was beyond reasoning with. He'd pulled out a small bag of white powder and was desperately trying to snort it with hands that shook too violently to function. Marcus knew he had seconds before Ray circled around the truck and cornered him. The chains made running almost impossible, but they were his only hope. He grabbed the chains with both hands, lifting them slightly to reduce their drag, and ran toward the tree line as fast as his injured body would carry him. The forest was thick with underbrush and fallen logs that made movement difficult even for someone who wasn't chained. Marcus could hear Ray crashing through the woods behind him, cursing and shouting threats. But the same obstacles that slowed Marcus down also worked against his pursuer. And Ray was older and carrying extra weight that worked against him in rough terrain. Marcus had one advantage that he hoped would save his life. He was running for survival while Ray was just doing a job. Desperation gave Marcus energy that Ray couldn't match, and fear sharpened his focus to a knife's edge. The chains caught on everything. Every fallen branch, every thorny bush, every uneven piece of ground threatened to send Marcus sprawling, but he kept moving, driven by the absolute certainty that being caught meant death. Ray wouldn't make the mistake of keeping him alive a second time. Behind him, Marcus could hear Ray's pursuit growing more distant. The older man was struggling with the terrain and couldn't match Marcus's desperate pace. But Marcus also knew that Ray would eventually return to the truck and use it to search the area more systematically. The forest was vast, but vehicles could cover ground much faster than a man in chains. Marcus needed to find water. Streams and rivers would slow down vehicle pursuit and might offer him a way to travel without leaving obvious tracks. More importantly, he was already becoming dehydrated, and his injured body needed water to function. He found a small creek about a mile from where he'd escaped, hidden in a depression between two hills. The water was cold and clear, and Marcus drank deeply before considering his next move. The creek flowed roughly north, which would take him away from the direction they'd been traveling in the truck. The chains were a constant problem. They caught on rocks in the streambed and made walking in the water nearly impossible. But Marcus had an idea. The wrench he'd used to escape was still clutched in his hand, and while it wasn't designed for the job, it might be able to help him with the padlocks. Marcus had learned some basic lock-picking techniques in college from a friend who was studying computer security. The skills were rusty and these were high-quality locks, but desperation and adrenaline helped him focus. After nearly an hour of careful work, he managed to open one of the padlocks. Freeing one leg made an enormous difference in his mobility, though the remaining chain still slowed him down significantly. Marcus worked for another hour on the second lock, but this one seemed to have a different mechanism, and his improvised techniques weren't working. The sound of engines in the distance made the decision for him. Ray had returned to the truck and was now searching systematically, probably with Danny as backup, despite his drug-induced breakdown. Marcus left the creek and headed deeper into the forest, hoping to put as much distance as possible between himself and his pursuers. The afternoon sun was brutal, and Marcus's injuries were becoming infected. The cuts Tommy had made with a knife were bleeding through his torn shirt, and he could feel fever beginning to build in his system. Without medical attention, infection would kill him, even if Ray and Danny didn't find him first. But Marcus kept moving. He had no choice. Behind him, the sound of engines grew closer and more systematic. Ray was driving back and forth along the network of logging roads that crisscrossed this part of the forest, trying to box Marcus in and force him into an area where he could be tracked on foot. As evening approached, Marcus realized he was losing the race. His body was shutting down from blood loss, infection, and exhaustion. The remaining chain around his ankle had rubbed his skin raw, and every step was agony. He couldn't outrun vehicles indefinitely, especially not in his condition. That's when he heard the gunshots. They were close enough to echo clearly through the trees, and they weren't random hunting shots. These were deliberate rapid-fire bursts that suggested someone was shooting at a specific target. Ray and Danny had found something or someone else to focus their attention on. Marcus changed direction and crept toward the sound of the shooting, hoping to understand what was happening. If Ray and Danny were distracted by something else, it might give him the opportunity he needed to escape the area entirely. What he found when he reached the source of the gunfire was completely unexpected. A man in hunting clothes was pinned down behind a fallen log, returning fire at Ray and Danny, who had taken cover behind their truck. The hunter appeared to be alone, and he was clearly outgunned, but he was holding his position with the calm precision of someone who knew how to handle a firefight. Marcus couldn't understand what had started the gunfight, but he realized it might be his salvation. If the hunter survived, he might be willing to help. If the hunter didn't survive, at least Ray and Danny would be distracted long enough for Marcus to get further away. The battle raged for nearly 20 minutes. The hunter was using a hunting rifle with a scope, and his shots were precise and well aimed. Ray and Danny had handguns in superior numbers. but they were forced to stay in cover because the hunter's rifle could reach them from positions their handguns couldn't match. Marcus watched from concealment as the hunter systematically destroyed the truck's tires and engine block, effectively stranding Ray and Danny in the forest. It was a brilliant tactical move that demonstrated military or law enforcement training. Ray seemed to realize his situation was becoming desperate. He grabbed something from the truck, Marcus couldn't see what, and made a break for the tree line on the far side of the clearing. Danny, meanwhile, appeared to be having another drug-induced breakdown and was firing wildly without aiming. The hunter shifted position and put 2 quick shots into Danny's cover, forcing him to duck down. Then he disappeared into the forest, apparently pursuing Ray. The shooting stopped, but Marcus could hear the 2 men crashing through the woods as the chase continued. Marcus approached Danny's position carefully. The meth addict was hiding behind the truck, sobbing and calling for his brother Tommy, apparently forgetting that Tommy was either dead or critically injured miles away. The drugs had completely disconnected Danny from reality. Marcus circled around the truck and approached from Danny's blind spot. The man was so far gone on methamphetamines that he didn't notice Marcus until it was too late. Using the wrench again, Marcus knocked Danny unconscious with a single blow. The truck was disabled, but Marcus found Danny's cell phone and Ray's backup weapon. More importantly, he found keys to the remaining padlock around his ankle. Within minutes, Marcus was completely free of the chains that had slowed him down for hours, but his relief was short-lived. Ray was still alive somewhere in the forest, along with an unknown hunter who might or might not be willing to help a stranger. And Marcus was still lost in hundreds of square miles of wilderness, with infected wounds and no real survival skills. The cell phone had no signal, which didn't surprise Marcus given their remote location. But it did contain contact information that might be useful to law enforcement if Marcus survived long enough to reach them. Names, phone numbers, and what appeared to be a network of people involved in human trafficking. As darkness fell, Marcus had to make a decision. He could try to find the hunter who had saved him from Ray and Danny, or he could strike out on his own and hope to find civilization before his injuries killed him. The choice was made for him. When he heard Ray's voice calling through the darkness, "I know you're out here somewhere, college boy. That hunter's dead now, and it's just you and me. Come out now and I'll make it quick. Make me hunt you down and you'll die slow." Ray was lying about killing the hunter. Marcus could hear someone else moving through the forest, stalking Ray with the patient precision of an experienced tracker. But Ray was also getting closer to Marcus's position, and the injured software engineer knew he couldn't outrun an armed man in the darkness. That's when Marcus heard something that gave him hope for the first time in hours. The sound of someone moving through the forest with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The hunter was still alive, and he was closing in on Ray's position. Dale Whitehorse had been tracking wounded elk through the Dakota wilderness for 37 years, and he knew the difference between an animal moving through the forest and a human trying to move quietly. The man stalking through the darkness ahead of him was good, but he wasn't Dakota good. And he definitely wasn't someone who had grown up learning to read the forest like a book written in footprints and broken branches. Dale was 53 years old, a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, and a man who had spent more time in these woods than most people spent in their own homes. He worked as a hunting guide during the season and a search and rescue volunteer year-round. He knew every square mile of this forest, every deer trail and creek bed and hidden meadow. What he'd stumbled upon that morning had shaken him more than anything he'd encountered in decades of wilderness work. Dale had been checking his trail cameras when he heard the sound of chains scraping against rocks somewhere ahead of him. It was a sound that didn't belong in the natural world, mechanical and harsh against the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. His first thought was that someone was dragging equipment through the forest, maybe a broken ATV or hunting gear. But when Dale crept closer to investigate, what he saw made his blood freeze. A young man was being dragged behind a pickup truck, heavy chains wrapped around his ankles, and his body bouncing helplessly over rocks and fallen branches. The man was conscious and trying desperately to protect his head and face, but he was clearly in agony and losing the fight against the rough terrain. 3 men in the truck were laughing and drinking beer while they tortured their victim, taking turns speeding up and slowing down to maximize the suffering. It was the most casually evil thing Dale had ever witnessed, and it took all of his self-control not to open fire immediately. Instead, Dale followed at a distance, using skills his grandfather had taught him to move through the forest without being detected. He needed to understand what he was dealing with before he acted. Were these men just sadists playing with a victim, or was this part of something larger and more organized? What he learned during the next few hours changed everything Dale thought he knew about the remote area he'd called home for his entire life. The men dragged their victim for more than 3 miles, stopping periodically to check whether he was still alive and to adjust the chains when they became tangled in obstacles. They spoke about delivery schedules, client preferences, and payment methods with the casual professionalism of people running a business. They were human traffickers, and this forest that Dale loved was being used as a highway for monsters. When the truck finally stopped and the victim made his desperate escape attempt, Dale was positioned on high ground about 200 yards away. He watched through his rifle scope as the young man attacked his captor with improvised weapons, showed incredible courage in running despite the chains, and demonstrated more survival instinct than Dale had expected from what appeared to be a city dweller. But Dale also saw that the victim wouldn't make it on his own. The man was injured, exhausted, and completely unfamiliar with wilderness survival. Even if he evaded immediate recapture, infection and exposure would kill him within days. The decision to intervene directly came when Dale saw Ray systematically hunting the escaped victim with professional skill. Ray moved through the forest like someone with military training, and his tactics suggested he'd done this sort of thing before. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. It was an organized operation with experienced personnel. Dale had been a Marine before returning to the reservation, and some skills never fade. He positioned himself where he could control the high ground and began the process of eliminating threats to the victim. The first shot was carefully calculated to disable the truck without killing anyone. Dale put a round through the engine block that would leave the vehicle inoperable but wouldn't cause an explosion that might harm the victim. He wanted to limit his enemy's mobility before engaging them directly. Ray and Danny took cover and returned fire, but their handguns were no match for Dale's scoped hunting rifle at distance. Dale had been shooting competitively since childhood, and his familiarity with the terrain gave him advantages that his opponents couldn't match. The firefight lasted longer than Dale preferred, but he used the time to study his enemies and gather intelligence about their capabilities. Ray was clearly the leader and the most dangerous threat. Danny appeared to be chemically impaired and was firing wildly without any tactical awareness. When Ray made his break for the tree line, Dale saw an opportunity to end the threat without further violence. He shifted position and herded Ray away from the victim's location, while simultaneously cutting off any escape routes that would allow Ray to reach help or reinforcements. The pursuit through the forest became a deadly game of cat and mouse that tested every skill Dale had learned in 4 decades of tracking. Ray was good, but he was operating in Dale's territory now, and the hunter had advantages that no amount of training could overcome. Dale knew where every fallen log created cover, where every creek provided concealment, where the ground was soft enough to muffle footsteps, and where it was hard enough to leave minimal tracks. He used this knowledge to stay ahead of Ray's attempts at ambush while gradually forcing him into areas where escape would be impossible. But Ray was more dangerous than Dale had initially realized. The man carried military-grade equipment including night vision gear and communications equipment that suggested he was part of a larger organization. This wasn't just a local trafficking operation. It was connected to something with significant resources and professional capabilities. As full darkness fell, Dale realized the situation was more complex than a simple rescue operation. Ray's radio chatter indicated that backup was on the way, possibly within hours. If Dale was going to save the victim and prevent these criminals from escaping to continue their operations, he needed to act quickly and decisively. Dale had always been a patient hunter, willing to wait hours or days for the perfect shot. But tonight, patience could get an innocent man killed. He closed the distance between himself and Ray, using terrain features and natural cover to approach within 50 yards of his target. Ray was hiding behind a large boulder, speaking quietly into his radio about extraction plans and cleanup protocols. "This is Unit 7 requesting immediate exfiltration," Ray whispered into his device. "Operation is compromised. We have 1 asset still mobile, but civilian interference has neutralized primary team." Dale understood enough military terminology to know that Ray's backup would arrive soon, and that they considered Marcus to be valuable enough to risk exposure. These weren't just local criminals. They were part of a network with resources and reach that extended far beyond North Dakota. But they had made one critical mistake. They had brought their evil into Dale Whitehorse's forest, and Dale took that personally. Ray never saw the attack coming. Dale approached from downwind, moving with the silent precision his grandfather had taught him, and disabled Ray with the stock of his rifle before the trafficker could use his radio again. Ray was unconscious but alive when Dale zip-tied his hands and legs with restraints from his own backpack. Dale wasn't a killer by nature, but he was absolutely committed to making sure these men faced justice for what they'd done. With Ray secured, Dale began the process of tracking down the victim he'd been trying to save. The young man had left a clear trail despite his obvious efforts to move carefully, and Dale could see from the blood drops that his injuries were serious. Dale found Marcus huddled next to the disabled truck, using Ray's dropped weapon to guard Danny's unconscious form. The victim was clearly in shock and badly injured, but he was alert enough to recognize help when it arrived. "Don't shoot!" Marcus called out as Dale approached with his hands visible. "I'm the one they were after. Are you law enforcement?" "I'm someone who doesn't like seeing innocent people hurt in my forest," Dale replied, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "My name is Dale Whitehorse. I'm going to get you out of here, but first we need to deal with your injuries." Marcus broke down completely when he realized he was finally safe. The combination of relief, shock, and physical exhaustion overwhelmed him, and Dale had to support him to prevent him from collapsing. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. Ray's radio had been broadcasting coded messages for hours, and Dale knew that meant reinforcements were coming. They needed to get Marcus to medical attention and get both of them to safety before Ray's organization sent more people to clean up the situation. Dale activated his own emergency radio and called for immediate law enforcement and medical support, using codes that would bring every available resource in the region to their location. But help was at least an hour away, and Dale wasn't sure they had that much time. As if to confirm his fears, Dale heard the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Someone with serious resources was coming to collect their people and eliminate any witnesses. Dale and Marcus were about to face an enemy with capabilities that matched or exceeded anything Dale had encountered in his military service. The hunter checked his ammunition and studied the terrain around the disabled truck. If they were going to survive until help arrived, Dale would need to use every advantage the forest could provide against enemies who were bringing military-grade equipment and professional training to the fight. Marcus was barely conscious and in no condition to move quickly, which meant Dale would have to make his stand right here. The young software engineer had already shown incredible courage and determination, but the next few hours would test both men in ways neither had ever imagined. The helicopter that appeared over the forest clearing wasn't what Dale had expected. Instead of the military-style aircraft that would have brought Ray's reinforcements, this was a North Dakota State Police search and rescue helicopter responding to Dale's emergency call. Help had arrived faster than anyone had hoped, guided by the GPS coordinates Dale had transmitted and the distinctive sound of gunfire that had echoed through the wilderness. But Dale's relief was tempered by the knowledge that Ray's backup was still coming. His military experience told him that the radio chatter he'd intercepted meant serious trouble was inbound, possibly within the hour. "This is Search and Rescue 7, came the voice through Dale's radio. "We have your position and are coming down. Are you secure?" "Negative," Dale replied, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "We have 2 suspects secured but expect additional hostile contacts. Request immediate law enforcement backup with tactical support." The helicopter pilot was experienced enough to understand the implications of Dale's words. Instead of landing in the clearing, he sat down in a protected area behind a ridge and deployed a paramedic and 2 state troopers who approached on foot with weapons ready. Marcus was barely conscious when the paramedic reached him, but the medical professional immediately recognized the signs of severe trauma and dehydration. While the medic worked to stabilize Marcus, the state troopers secured Ray and Danny, both of whom were regaining consciousness and demanding lawyers. Dale briefed the lead trooper, Sergeant Maria Santos, about what he'd witnessed and the radio transmissions suggesting additional threats were inbound. Santos was a 15-year veteran who'd served in Afghanistan before returning to law enforcement, and she immediately understood the tactical situation. "We need to get your victim out of here now," Santos said, studying the forest around them with professional wariness. "But we also need to be ready for whoever these people call for backup." The paramedic, a young man named Jeff Chen, who'd been working search and rescue for 8 years, had stabilized Marcus enough for transport. But moving him would be risky given the severity of his injuries and the possibility of ambush during evacuation. That's when Dale made a decision that probably saved all their lives. "I know this forest better than anyone," he told Santos. "There's an old logging road about half a mile north that leads directly to the highway. If we can get the victim there, you can have ground units pick him up, while we deal with whatever's coming." Santos looked at her map and saw immediately that Dale was right. The logging road would provide protected access for additional law enforcement while keeping Marcus away from any potential firefight. "Do it," she decided. "Jeff, can he travel?" "Not easily, but he'll die if we don't get him to a hospital soon," the paramedic replied. "Those knife wounds are infected and he's lost a lot of blood." Dale and Jeff improvised a stretcher using equipment from the helicopter and began the careful process of moving Marcus through the forest. Santos and her partner stayed behind to secure the scene and wait for the backup that Ray's radio calls had summoned. The half-mile journey took nearly 40 minutes, with Dale navigating by landmarks only he could recognize in the darkness. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, but during his lucid moments, he managed to provide information about the trafficking operation that would prove crucial to the investigation. "There are others," Marcus whispered during one of his coherent periods. "They talked about regular deliveries, client lists, safe houses. This isn't just three guys grabbing random hikers." Dale stored every piece of information Marcus provided, knowing it would be vital for law enforcement. But his primary focus remained on getting the young men to safety before Ray's people arrived to clean up the operation. They reached the logging road just as a convoy of law enforcement vehicles arrived from both directions. The FBI had been notified, along with state police tactical units and federal agencies that specialized in human trafficking investigations. Marcus was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the regional hospital in Grand Forks, where trauma surgeons worked for 6 hours to repair the damage inflicted by Tommy's knife. He would spend 2 weeks in intensive care, but he would survive with no permanent physical disabilities. Meanwhile, back in the forest, Sergeant Santos and her backup units were preparing for a confrontation that would change their understanding of organized crime in North Dakota. The backup Ray had called arrived exactly 1 hour after Dale's initial report, just as predicted. But instead of finding a clean operation and extracted personnel, they walked into the largest law enforcement response in the region's history. 3 black SUVs approached the clearing from different directions, carrying 8 men with military-grade weapons and equipment that suggested federal law enforcement or military training. They moved with the professional competence of people accustomed to violence, and their communications indicated they expected to eliminate any witnesses and extract their personnel without interference. What they found instead was a carefully planned ambush by officers who had been given time to prepare positions and coordinate their response. The FBI had taken command of the scene, and Agent Sarah Mitchell brought resources that the traffickers hadn't expected to face. "Federal agents, drop your weapons and surrender immediately," came the amplified voice through the darkness. The response was immediate gunfire from multiple positions as the trafficking organization's cleanup crew attempted to fight their way to their captured personnel. But they were outgunned, outnumbered, and operating in unfamiliar territory against law enforcement officers who'd had time to prepare. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes. 2 of the traffickers were killed, and 6 were captured, along with vehicles containing enough evidence to dismantle a trafficking network that extended across 3 states. Ray, who had regained consciousness during the battle, attempted to bargain for a reduced sentence by providing information about the organization's operations. What he revealed shocked even experienced investigators. The trafficking ring had been operating for more than 5 years, using remote wilderness areas across the upper Midwest to move victims between safe houses and buyers. They specifically targeted hikers, campers, and other people who could disappear without immediate searches being launched. Marcus had been scheduled for delivery to a buyer in Chicago who had paid $50,000 for a specific type of victim. The organization maintained detailed profiles of potential targets, based on social media activity, travel patterns, and personal information gathered through various sources. Tommy, who survived his head injury but suffered permanent brain damage, had been the organization's primary recruiter and was responsible for at least 12 other kidnappings over the previous 3 years. Danny provided additional information in exchange for drug treatment, revealing locations of safe houses and burial sites for victims who hadn't survived their captivity. The investigation that followed Marcus's rescue led to the arrest of 43 people across 7 states and the rescue of 11 other victims who were still being held by the organization. Federal prosecutors described it as one of the largest human trafficking busts in the region's history. Dale Whitehorse was recognized by the FBI and state law enforcement for his actions, but he declined most of the official ceremonies. For him, protecting the forest and the people in it was simply what needed to be done. Marcus recovered fully from his physical injuries, though the psychological trauma required extensive therapy. He returned to his job in Minneapolis but spent every weekend volunteering with organizations that help trafficking victims. His relationship with Sarah deepened as she supported him through his recovery, and they married 2 years later. 6 months after his rescue, Marcus returned to North Dakota to meet with Dale and thank him personally. The 2 men had maintained contact during Marcus's recovery, developing an unlikely friendship based on shared trauma and mutual respect. "I've been thinking about what you said that night," Marcus told Dale as they sat beside the lake where his nightmare had begun. "About the forest taking care of people who respect it." Dale smiled, watching the sun set over water that reflected the sky like a mirror. "The forest doesn't make distinctions about who deserves help. That's something people have to decide for themselves." Marcus nodded, understanding that Dale's actions that night had been motivated by something deeper than duty or training. They came from a fundamental belief that evil shouldn't be allowed to flourish anywhere, especially not in places of natural beauty and peace. What would have happened if you hadn't been there? Marcus asked. Dale considered the question seriously before answering. Someone else would have found you eventually. The forest has a way of revealing secrets when the time is right. But Marcus knew the truth. Without Dale's intervention, he would have become another statistic in an investigation that might never have happened. The trafficking ring would have continued operating, claiming victims who vanished without trace into networks that treated human beings as merchandise. Instead, Marcus was alive, dozens of criminals were in prison, and other potential victims were safe because one man had refused to look the other way when evil invaded his forest. The lake was peaceful in the fading light, its surface broken only by the occasional rise of feeding fish. It was hard to believe that such a beautiful place had been the starting point for so much darkness. But Marcus had learned that evil could flourish anywhere if good people chose not to act. Dale Whitehorse had chosen to act, and that choice had saved Marcus's life and the lives of people he would never meet. It was a reminder that heroism often comes from ordinary people who simply refuse to let evil succeed on their watch. As they prepared to leave the lake, Marcus asked one final question. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if our paths hadn't crossed that weekend? Dale shouldered his pack and checked his compass before answering. I don't wonder about that. What happened was supposed to happen. The forest brought you to me when you needed help, and I was there when you needed someone to stand up for you. That's how it's supposed to work. Marcus knew that Dale was right. Sometimes the most important moments in life happen when two strangers choose to trust each other in circumstances that test everything they believe about humanity and courage.
His weekend camping trip had become something much different than what he'd planned, but it had also shown him that there are still people in the world who will risk everything to protect someone they've never met.
That knowledge would stay with Marcus for the rest of his life, along with the certainty that when darkness threatens to overwhelm hope, sometimes the forest itself sends help in the form of someone who refuses to look the other way.